Okay, so chapter 33 is really an introduction to anatomy and physiology. And a lot of you will be going on into that course in college. And so you want to look at chapter 33 as a very nice overview, just very basic overview of the different types of tissues, for example, and a small amount of detail that you need to know about each type. So this will be the same information you'll learn when you first start anatomy. So this gives you a little head start. So, and we're focusing on humans, and that'll be your focus in your human anatomy class too. So in humans, there's 4 main types of tissue, and I went over this in the lecture. And so you've got to, first in your notes and then in your memory, you need to organize this information into 4 main categories. So you have the epithelial, you have connective tissue, you have muscle, and you have neural. All right, those are the 4 main types. So you've got these 4 categories. And for each one, you want to have a general definition. And the main definition of epithelial is it lines the outside and some of the inner surfaces of the body. I know that's very general, but it gives you a starting point. And epithelial cells, skin is a good example because it forms the outer lining of the body and then some of the inner lining. Epithelial cells come in a variety of shapes, which we'll get to later. A lot of them are very flattened to create a surface. And so in this picture, you have a little hint. Number 1, first of all, they're showing a piece of skin. Second of all, they have the words lines the surfaces in the body. So that needs to then bring up, okay, well, I know the answer is one of the 4 main types. Is it epithelial, connective, muscle, or neural? Well, that goes along. Number 1 is showing epithelial. Okay, you don't have to get any more specific than that. Okay, just the type of tissue that's given as an example here. Number 2, made up of fibers that contract, and you can see it's going to a certain part of the picture, and they're giving you kind of a crummy picture, but still, that's muscle tissue. So muscle tissue is the only ones that contract, that move bones or move other parts of the body. And so muscle cells and muscle fibers, that would be some terminology that would go with muscle tissue. Number 3, you can kind of recognize almost the image of the neural cell in the enlarged picture anyway here. And the other thing is it says consists of cells with projections that transmit electrical signals. So transmit, it forms like a system of wires in your body, and the electrical signals run through the wiring. And ultimately, the interaction between the neurons and the muscles, neurons have the electrical signal that stimulate the muscles to do their contractions. But the tissue itself that transmits electrical signals or passes along electrical signals is neural tissue. So if you can't tell by the image of the neurons shown in the close-up picture, then maybe the words help you. And then number 4, I'm going to scroll down here. Number 4, there's all kinds of connective tissues. So number 4, you're kind of on this bottom half of the picture. And there's different types of connective tissue. And there's really 5 or actually 6 types, but 4 of them are shown here. So when you go back to your notes, you'll notice there's really 6, but you're just supposed to recognize for number 4 that all of this stuff at the bottom of the picture, loose bone, cartilage, and blood, make up some of the connective tissues. And connective tissues is harder to define. So there was a really long definition in my lecture, but the way the definition works, it's general enough to be able to include all these different types of tissue. So loose connective tissue, bone, cartilage, blood, adipose, and So that's all you needed for this first part. So sometimes students look at this and think that they need to go more specific, but look at what it's asking you for, the main types. So that structure in your mind, maybe 4 columns, you could summarize a lot of that part of the lecture in some kind of chart. The name of the type of tissue, the definition of the tissue, and then examples of specific tissues that fit into that category. All right, then we go into blood. Blood is made up of plasma and cells. What are the components of plasma? Remember, plasma is the water-based part, and it has some dissolved proteins, and it has salt and different electrolytes in it. And there are the different proteins that are in it are the globulins, immunoglobulins, also called antibodies. It has a fair amount of albumin, which is important in regulating blood pressure. And it also has globins, which is different than globulins. And if you can straighten that confusion out, you'll be ahead of the game. But globins carry oxygen. A lot of the globins are inside of red blood cells, but there can be some globins from burst cells that are in the plasma. But really your components of plasma are going to be your protein components, especially albumin, your antibodies, immunoglobulins, and then electrolytes and such. There are some other proteins too that are important for blood clotting, like fibrinogen, those kinds of things. So protein components dissolved in the water itself, and then the electrolytes, the salt, the chloride, sodium chloride, potassium, and these kinds of things. A little bicarbonate. Bicarbonate helps to regulate the pH of your blood because it's a buffer, which you may recall what a buffer is. It can reduce and raise the pH of the blood to try to keep it at a stable level. And then the cellular components of blood. So there's really 3 cellular components of blood, or at least this is how we, again, make these little columns. The cellular components will be red blood cells called erythrocytes, white blood cells that we call leukocytes, and then some pieces of cells we sometimes call thrombocytes, but they're really the platelets, and they're really just cell fragments. They're not really whole cells, but we still consider them in the cellular component category. And, I didn't make this up. This is just the way it's done. So you have to accept some of these things just the way it is. All right. Now, epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue, that's the tissue that lines the outer and some of the inner surfaces of the body, all right? And you have the squamous, the cuboidal, and the columnar. Those are the shapes of the cells. In addition, you have the simple. Simple means one layer of cells, and that's already marked here. So the first column in this picture is all simple. The second column is stratified, means more than one layer. And then we had something special called pseudo-stratified. It's really not stratified, but it kind of looks like it is, or it might, under a microscope, it might mislead you to think it's stratified, so you kind of have to be aware of it. Although we're not going to get too involved with that one, and that'll be something for you to learn a little more about in your actual anatomy class. But in terms of simple, there's 3 shapes, and in terms of stratified, there's 3 shapes. The shapes of the cells are, if they're very flattened, they're squamous. Some people say squamous. I say squamous. Ask your anatomy professor how they pronounce it. Cuboidal is what it sounds like. It doesn't have to be a perfect cube, but it's very sort of fat and cube-like. The picture here is very cube-like under the simple column. Under the stratified column, it looks a little more hexagonal, but it's still considered cuboidal as a general term. And then if it's very elongated, that's columnar, like a column. And in this picture, the stratified columnar, you kind of have to look at this one and see how it's a little bit more elongated than the stratified cuboidal. In real life, sometimes it's hard to tell, but you will get used to that. But the picture I would use would be something like this, so you'd be able to tell. Because we're just starting out. You don't have to be an expert yet. All right, and then down here I have a place for you to put the 6 types of connective tissue. And you have loose connective tissue, and you do need to know the definition for connective tissue, the general definition. It has cells in some kind of matrix, which means something outside of the cells, which typically causes the cells to be spaced out somewhat. And the matrix, they use that term because that's where it can be a lot of different things that the cells are sort of suspended in. But make sure you know that definition. There are proteins in the matrix. But anyway, the cells and the matrix make up kind of a general definition of connective tissue. You have loose connective tissue, you have fibrous or sometimes called dense connective tissue like tendons, you have cartilage, you have bone, you have adipose, and you have blood. And I always think it's interesting that blood is considered a connective tissue, but it does fit the definition of having cells and then some other stuff we call plasma that has proteins in it. But blood is the only type that doesn't have collagen, and collagen is a main part of the rest of the types of connective tissue. But blood doesn't have that protein in particular, but it's still considered a type of connective tissue. The 3 types of muscles, so we're talking about smooth, we're talking about striated, and cardiac. The only one that is voluntary is striated. That means you can choose when to contract those muscles. A cardiac muscle and other and the smooth muscles, those are all involuntary. Thank goodness we don't have to think every time our heart beats or every time our digestive system squeezes to move food through. So muscles contract and relax to move things. Skeletal muscle, which would be striated muscle, moves bones, but the cardiac muscle causes the heart to pump, and the smooth muscle, that's in a lot of your organs, but particularly we'll talk about the muscle of the diaphragm, which makes your lungs, makes you breathe, or maybe we should say makes you aerate your lungs, all right, and ventilate your lungs. And then other smooth muscles move food through the digestive tract. So that'll be the basics that you would need to know. All right. And then the neuron. So I mentioned before, you kind of recognize the picture of the neuron in that earlier part of this activity. The main part of the neuron, which is down here, you can see where my arrow is, that is the soma or body. That's also where the nucleus is. Soma, S-O-M-A, or body of the neuron. Up here, though, these little branches that are sticking out are called dendrites. And then you have this long axon. And then at the end, you have these terminals. So the terminals connect to the dendrites of the next neuron. So the neurons are always connected, well, let's say always, but at a basic level, we think of the neurons connected from soma to terminal, and then the next soma to terminal, and in that way. And neurons pass electrical impulses through the body, primarily from the muscles, from the senses, skin, from the sensory neurons to the brain, and then back from the brain to, for example, your muscles to get a reaction of some type. So they carry signals, electrical signals, which is why if you get hit by lightning, sometimes your heart stops, because the neural signal to make your heart beat, to make the neurons that stimulate the contraction of the cardiac muscles, gets messed up just like it blows out your electrical system in your house, it blows out the electrical system in your body potentially. But so that's, you know, good enough, and we're going to just take these things at this very introductory level, but make sure you have a definition for each of these. Simplistic, yes, but a definition for each of these 4 types of tissues. So epithelial, with some details that you need to know. Connective, the 6 types of connective, including parts of the blood and components of the blood. Muscle, a little bit about muscle, a little bit about neurons. So this worksheet is a pretty nice review, maybe not 100% of the material from the chapter, but a good review of what you would want to know, like in your immediate knowledge base as you move into your anatomy class. So I hope this helps.